I know this is going to be a bit of a controversial thing to say, but 1974's Messiah of Evil is a movie that is difficult to quantify on a scale on if it is actually good or not. At a surface glance, it is a pretty messy film that wasn't even finished that makes little sense. One that presents its core mystery as being a murder or disappearance story that isn't even really resolved because they never filmed enough scenes for the plot to actually entirely be explained, with the scenes that they did finish occasionally feeling like they last for a decade. And all around as a work, it could easily be convincingly argued to be a complete, unmitigated disaster of a production, as it pretty much was seen at the time of its release critically. And yet, here we are over 50 years later talking about it. So there's gotta be something there, no? Filmed in 1971, the project was written and directed by husband and wife team Gloria Katz and Willard Hayek, who were basically just starting out here but eventually would go on to be core members of George Lucas's writing team, where they would work on the scripts for American Graffiti, Star Wars, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, and Howard the Duck. The pair after this would never again work in horror outside of this film, if you don't count Temple of Doom that is, which is a real shame because the central ideas here are very, very good, and are not the main issue that is plaguing this as a work. Despite how iconic it is, there's actually not a lot of information out there about this. But basically from what I can tell, they only ended up shooting like 70% of what they had written in 1971 under the title of The Second Coming, before they eventually ran out of money. And after not being able to secure additional funding, the project was basically abandoned. According to actor Anitra Ford, nothing happened for the next 2 years until French investors bought the footage that they had shot, and then hired an editor to put something together that was at least watchable, so that they could then release the film for the European market, which is in part one of the reasons why the film feels so surreal. Back when I was an editor, occasionally you would either be given footage that was so bad, or you'd be asked to work on something where they simply had not filmed enough coverage to get an edit that one could reasonably actually call what they had made a movie. And in those cases, you've always just got to lean hard into vibes in the edit to just salvage anything that audiences can at least jive with, even if that leaves the plot totally impossible to follow. In those kinds of situations, the plot is kind of the least important thing that you're worrying about. Often on short films, in my experience, if they're asking an editor to work on it instead of editing it themselves, it's frequently because they've got a complete train wreck on their hands and don't know what to do with it. I was once given a short to edit, and when I turned in my first draft, the filmmaker was kind of mad at me because I'd entirely cut out one of the main characters. That her performance was so awful that it bordered on being genuinely unwatchable any time that she was on the screen. They eventually hired a different editor, and their final version of the movie was over twice as long as my cut and also twice as bad. But at least you could actually follow the plot, I guess. What's funny is that experience led me to getting brought on board to other projects, because several people who were at that screening of this movie saw how bad their cut of the short was, but then heard that there was a better version of it that I had cut, which resulted in me being asked to fix up other short films later on. But from my perspective, that's essentially what's going on here and is kind of part of the magic of Messiah of Evil. They hired editor Scott Conrad to work on this, who's great and actually won an Academy Award for Rocky later on that decade. But he does make some strange decisions here as well, which might just have been the reality of what he had at his disposal. We will never know. If the footage just simply does not exist, there's only so much one can do. But there's also just so many long, bizarre stretches in the film where just nothing is happening that could be described as interesting, where characters lounge in their homes and talk about their lives outside of the plot in a dreamy way that indicate that they're only half interested in each other as people. The story is about a woman named Arletty whose father has disappeared. He was a famous world-renowned artist, and she goes looking for him, with the only clues to his whereabouts being a diary that she discovers that is filled with mad ramblings about monsters and visions, and how he is forced to travel to the sleepy town of Point Dune for mysterious unknown reasons. I don't know if this was actually an inspiration for them or not, but I would 100% believe that the film made a direct impact on the direction that Silent Hill 2 would take 30 years later, because the setup and execution are shockingly similar. This strange production and release has also resulted in the film being labeled under different names over the past 50 years, including The Dead People, Night of the Damned, Return of the Living Dead, and Revenge of the Screaming Dead, despite the fact that the creatures in this movie are totally silent and never scream once, and aren't even really zombies or actually dead in the traditional sense. Also, another weird little fact that I don't know where to include, so I'll just say it here, but The guy at the beginning of this movie that gets killed by the child, which is a scene that is totally 100% unexplained by the end of the film, was played by Walter Hill, who's the guy who wrote Alien despite not actually receiving screen credit for it in the movie. He had taken a rough, unpolished script that Dan O'Bannon had written and did 8 additional drafts on top of it, changing most aspects of the story into the film that we know today. But because of Guild rules, O'Bannon had to be credited as the writer, even if the final version didn't really resemble his script at all. When Messiah of Evil decides that it wants to be a good movie again, it does it better than just about anything else. Based on visuals alone, I imagine most would be shocked to learn that this movie is not Italian, because everything about it is steeped in the sensibilities of Italian horror of that era, not just in its colors and shot composition, but even in its casting and performances that these actors are giving. And I just want to reiterate that the coloring of this film is absolutely gorgeous to look at. You don't need a lot of money to make a movie that looks good by utilizing smart design and color usage, and this is a textbook example of that. The fact that this was made by Americans in California is actually kind of astonishing to me, and I don't really know how they managed to pull it off so authentically, because most would, I think, way overdo it in trying to emulate the Italian style, but this feels so authentic in every imaginable way. The film is horribly atmospheric and dreamy to a point that it makes it very difficult for me to watch at times, and its horror concepts are some of the few that can actually accurately be described as Lovecraftian and Lynchian, as most things that are ever given that label almost always exclusively push the style of that feel too far into existing in a place of ungrounded parody. There's a scene early in this that is so startling that I think it is one of the most underrated horror moments in any film, where our protagonist has been told that there might be a clue to figuring out the mystery of her father's disappearance at a local hotel. And when she arrives, she knocks on the door that she has been told to go to, and this very disheveled man looks at her, and then directly into the camera and says, "I'm as old as the hills. Mama delivered me herself. She took me from between her legs, bloody little mess. She was about to feed me to the chickens, and Daddy said, 'Maybe we could use a little boy, Lottie.' That's how I came into the world." And if you like that, then you're gonna love this whole film because it essentially exists in that kind of reality consistently. Weird, unexplainable things are happening all around the town of Point Dune. One person has said that they noticed that the local children only eat raw meat. An albino man at a gas station just outside of town is seen driving a truck full of dead bodies, who have all had their eyes removed, and later picks up a hitchhiker with a truck full of people who are captivated by staring at the sky. In fact, every night the townspeople make fires on the beach and watch the moon all night long. The man in the truck tells her that his favorite snack to eat is live wharf rats, and he bites the head off of one in front of her. At the same gas station, the attendant is spotted shooting bullets at sounds heard out in the dark, which he claims to be doing to keep away local wild dogs, although we don't really believe him. As the film unfolds, we learn that at the center of all of this is a man who is only known as the Dark Stranger. All that is known of him is that he once was a member of the Donner Party, and survived not just because of his consumption of human meat, but also because of a pact that he made with a god who came to the Dark Stranger in the wilderness, and ensured his survival if he would then in turn travel these lands and proselytize a new religion in this god's name, that is formed around the ritualistic consumption of raw human meat, and that the whole town of Point Dune is being turned into ghouls that now crave this meat, and worship the new god by the coming of the blood-red moon. There have long been rumors that the character of Tom was originally supposed to be evil in a twist ending that was never filmed. The Dark Stranger only appears in 3 shots in the entire film, and always with his face obscured. But it was Michael Greer who played him, who also played the role of Tom. He has since passed away, so you can't ask him, but he was quoted as saying in 1970 that in his next movie he was going to be playing the son of the devil. Now, he might have just been referring to the Dark Stranger and always knew that he would be playing dual roles within the film, or there might have been a lot more at play here than what made it into the final movie. The Dark Stranger's final appearance is especially suspect to me. The cult goes down to the beach and he emerges from the ocean, but then we cut to the next scene with that totally unresolved, which is horribly nightmarish. But I really think that this was an example of a scene that they only got to film part of, and that we would have gotten more of the Dark Stranger there had they actually finished making the movie in the way that it was intended. The actual scenes of horror in this are almost nauseatingly unpleasant, but are done with such an otherworldly, nightmarish touch. The movie theater scene in particular feels so wrong, where one of our protagonists walks into the theater to see that there's only a few people that are sitting way too close to the screen with their backs to us. But then once the film starts, the theater gets progressively more and more full in a way that is deeply off-putting. The scene where another character is walking around the empty grocery store for a prolonged period before finding other customers devouring the meat raw out of its packaging is similarly great. Both of these sequences are nearly silent. There isn't much of a score that is accompanying these images, and it adds to the pervasive dream feeling that this whole thing has, which may or may not have been the original intention behind how this footage was actually filmed, which I find fascinating to think about. This entire movie may have been completely different with a different editor, and I think that this movie is one of the greatest examples of showing the artistry behind the potential of editing. The original movie may have been much worse if they'd been allowed to finish it on their own terms, which is an interesting thought experiment to explore. Everything that works about this may have been totally unintentional on the part of the inexperienced filmmakers. It really has a tone that things are so unpleasant about it that it might have just been a complete wonderful accident. The opening hallway shot composition also is something that has become iconic in its own right, and has been repeated in so many movies now that it is a trope unto itself. I do not actually know if this was even the first time that it was done in a film, but it is at least certainly the best and also the earliest example that I can personally think of. Similarly to this film, while it ended up being the best movie that I've seen this year, I almost walked out of I Saw the TV Glow because of how nightmarish of an experience it was for me. And tonally, this operates kind of on that same level. Just don't go into this expecting the same level of narrative depth that had going on, because on that front, the film is, as I said, basically incoherent. I'm mostly talking about vibes here, which is what makes this so fun. But again, this actually constitutes very little of what's going on here. For the most part, you will have long, 20+ minute sections of people having conversations that absolutely do not matter whatsoever before the movie decides to drop one of the best things that you've ever seen on your head. It's a really odd movie to describe or even review in that sense because of that. Because I will admit, I don't actually even really like watching this film, but at the same time, it also has like 5 of the best moments in horror history in it, leaving it being this bizarre experience that is hard to recommend to people, as tonally it is very similar to something like Suspiria. But Suspiria is great and entertaining from beginning to end, and I feel like many people would be put off by this if you hype them up on it, saying that it was in the same vein as that. So it's a really weird and hard movie to recommend to people, because I don't even really like watching it that much, and I'll sit through some really slow movies. But I think it's also one of the best horror movies that I've ever seen that demonstrates how a lack of budget can really actually add to a film rather than take away from it. Because instead of being effects heavy, they instead have to focus on the craft of dread instead. And in that, they were able to make this perfectly weird movie with fascinating ideas that's also a little bit of an unbalanced experience, but I think it's important to remember.